Hey everyone, this is Louis7, and in this video I want to talk about the mission system once again now that the War of Three Peaks mini expansion has been out for a while in the Lord of the Rings Online. I already covered a detailed review of the system a couple weeks ago from beta, and honestly all of that still applies actually, so I will point you to that video if this doesn't cover everything, because for this video my focus is actually going to be on how I think the idea of missions is great, but the overall execution of how the system plays out in the game is not so great. And I think the best way to really summarize my thoughts on the missions is that they are just frustrating more than anything. So I think there is one major problem with the mission system that makes it feel poorly executed, even if I can enjoy the content at a baseline level, and that is that I don't ever feel motivated to run missions, and especially repeatedly doing missions. I just feel like there is no point in running them, and for a new system that is a major feature of the new mini expansion pack, that definitely should not be the case, and it really is unfortunate because, as I've mentioned, the idea of missions and some aspects of it I really do like and love. And I think the missions feel this way largely because the system is not rewarding for players, as in there are basically no rewards besides cosmetics, and even for the cosmetics it requires a ton of grinding to be able to get enough reputation for those. And there is also a daily and weekly quest that lets you very slowly build up motes of enchantment and a couple imbued LI boosts, but it takes so much effort to earn so little of those that I think they're insignificant enough to be neglected. Like if this was some sort of math or physics problem to calculate the reward for missions, you would assume they are zero because they're that little. So just to clarify, when I am talking about no real rewards for the rest of this video, what I mean is there is nothing that helps you build your character up to be better. And on top of that, about the rewards, the system and content in the missions themselves does not have much depth to it, so individual missions don't feel special enough to run repeatedly. So that creates this effect where at least I don't have motivation to run the missions, and ultimately I would rather spend my time in the game doing something else. So for the rest of this video, even though I covered the topics already in 2 minutes, I want you all to keep that in mind as we go into detail on how the idea of missions is good to begin with. Then I'll shift to talk about why it is a poorly executed system in the game and share some improvements missions could use. So, to get started with some of what makes the mission system a good idea, I'll cover what is perhaps a bit of a piece of news to some of you, and that is we actually had developer input on the mission system, which was a great thing to see. Made of Lions, who's a part of the LOTRO team, gave input on what is the point of missions. So one thing I have been critical about with Update 28 in general is the relative lack of communication and insight on the updates and content in the game. I still feel like a full dev diary on the missions would be great, but I really do just appreciate at least having some input, and I feel like us players have been so starved of developer communication for the past long while with LOTRO. But I'll digress from that to shift to kind of summarizing what it sounds like the developers think of the missions. First off, missions were intended to be a way to somewhat address the big problem in LOTRO, where there is a ton of content, so it is hard for new players to participate in the latest goings-ons and see like the newest areas of LOTRO as they are added and really play and connect with many long-term players. In War of Three Peaks, missions let you feel like you are helping in the war effort as the dwarves prepare to enter Gundabad and attempt to reclaim it from the orcs. You even get to see some of the higher level zones in areas you would otherwise be unable to see until you get caught up in LOTRO's huge amount of content. So moving on, it sounds like another big draw of missions for any level character really is they offer instant action and quick bursts of gameplay like simple monster camps or short dungeons, and chaining a few together can give you a satisfying MMO experience. And after that, they talked about how missions offer a lot of content for players. There are a ton of missions, actually 80 to be exact, and they go all over different nearby areas, and they really just let you again participate in the war effort while you still have other things to do in Middle Earth no matter what level you are. So that is what it sounds like the background on missions is from the dev's viewpoint. And I must say I agree with all the ideas there and think those things would be great for the game if they were implemented in a way that those ideas shine through with the new system. But again, as we'll get to later, I think the system was poorly executed, so those things I think end up being ignored or neglected and just passed over by players. But moving on, I do want to talk about some of the other ideas of missions that we see in the game that developers did not cover that I do like. And the first idea here is I like that The daily and weekly quests offer the story and gameplay of like the dwarves needing you to knock out a few tasks to aid in the war effort every day, and then just consistently doing that over time will reward you, or at least in theory that would reward you. But setting that aside, the second thing on the list is I like the rotating set of missions available every day, which this kind of suggests the dwarves have more concentrated efforts, and it creates the feeling of a dynamic system, even if that does mean it is limiting in your own effort to do missions because you can only do 8 a day per character because of this. And moving on to the third on my list, I like the idea of the missions being repeatable, and in terms of gameplay, this just means it's something you can invest your time into doing every day, and if there were proper rewards, this would mean you could get a daily rewarding gameplay experience for a short time investment. And then the final thing I have, the fourth extra idea I like, is that missions could be a quick and easy alternative for XP, and this would allow you to catch up to those newer areas that the individual missions could be like making you excited to see, as we discussed. So that is what I had, just all the things from the developer reply that I agree with, and a few points on my own list for the idea of missions. And I spent so long talking about liking these ideas because I think it is important to show you all that even though I'm going to talk about why missions are so badly implemented in the next section, that there is some good to be built off of, and if we continue to see missions in future content in LOTRO, I would continue to like to see these like shine through more, and that'll actually be another video topic I am planning on doing eventually. But moving on, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I think the poor implementation and execution stems from there being no real rewards, as in us players don't get much value for our characters for our time invested in missions, and that ultimately makes them feel like they aren't worth doing, or at least aren't worth repeating after the first few, especially when LOTRO offers many other systems and grinds that you could be better spending your time on. And that is really sad because again, the system is a good idea, but if players don't feel like they are worth running, then the system will be neglected by players, and like a lot of the developing work put into the new system and all the good stuff from it will likely be neglected. And I kind of think maybe the time and effort will maybe feel wasted like so many other systems in LOTRO's past, which would be sad, of course. And I think that is really where a lot of the frustration comes in for me with the missions and even some of Update 28 as a whole. I honestly feel like Standing Stone Games has not learned from previous systems and like their past failures and successes. For example, many players did not like the epic battle system, but one thing that did have going for it is it was rewarding. Skirmishes are actually a little bit similar to missions, and I've even planned to talk about that as like its own video. But those also give you a valuable reward for your time invested with skirmish marks, which are now just marks, medallions, and seals. And then even instances and raids, of course, they have reward and gear, and sometimes barter tokens, now even like embers of enchantment, that currency which can be bartered for more endgame stuff. And even things like warbands and roving threats, which they are super simple content, but they did give you some reward for your time invested to do them while you're out and about in Middle Earth. And you probably see where I'm going. All of these systems, while some have been neglected, they all had one very important property in common. They were rewarding for your time invested in doing them, and you got something beneficial to your character in progress. So on top of the missions having no rewards, one of the previous points I also made was that content inside the missions is shallow and the system itself doesn't have much depth. So each mission is like super simple and basically like a quest that takes a couple minutes, but at least for me personally, there are so many missions and so many similar missions that it kind of drowns them out for me. It makes each individual mission, like each moment of gameplay in them, feel a little bit less special and unique, which sucks because there are a lot of differences in uniqueness between some of the missions at least. But I just get the overall feeling when I play through them that individual missions just aren't too impactful really, and I don't think this would be much of a problem actually if they were at least rewarding while I was doing them. So moving on, I did a quick little thought experiment on many different player types and what their playtime in the missions system may go like, and the result is basically a high percent of players in LOTRO that begin going through like the missions would ultimately abandon it. I think completionists would probably spend the most time invested into the missions because there is a lot that you can do, and I think, as I mentioned, that is actually a good thing for people looking for that. There is a ton of content in missions, but all the other players will likely abandon their time investments into the system once they see they aren't actually getting anything out of it. Even the newer players that missions missions were partially targeted towards, they will likely find there are better ways to get XP, and in LOTRO there are better ways to level, and importantly keep up with things like class trait points and virtue traits at the same time. So overall, I just think that most casual participants, which probably makes up the vast majority of players here, they would ultimately not get much out of missions and would ignore it over time, basically because there are no valuable rewards to show for it, and the relative kind of lack of depth with the system does go hand in hand with that. But I could keep rambling on here, but the point is that missions are just not rewarding, and they give players little reason to run them, especially when players can decide to invest their time in something else and get a more fulfilling and rewarding gameplay experience out of it. So I don't want to do a video and not offer suggestions for improvement. So for the last big section in this video, let's talk about just that. And there are a ton of different suggestions I have for how missions could be made more rewarding. But in this video, I will focus on just a couple options that I think would be best. The first idea I had was there could be virtue XP. And to me, this would be like one of the most ideal and perfect things to go with the mission system. I mentioned this in every video and every place I talk about the missions, but all level characters need virtue XP, and it would also add another source and another place for players to get their virtue XP, so it is a big motivator and a good reward. And I think the mission system is perhaps a bit extra frustrating because, at least to me, this seems like the most obvious reward from missions, and I just don't get why, especially after the beta, after all the feedback during that not only I gave, but I saw a bunch of other people talking about this thing, just why it wasn't a reward after that really does seem like the perfect thing to me. But I need to move on from that, and the other idea I had was there could even be gear in the missions, or at least a small chance for like good skill and gear pieces after each mission. This could be beneficial for low-level players who decide to participate in missions, but they get nothing out of it as their character maybe advances in levels, but not in equipment or progression. And then for level cap characters, it could help them get caught up to the end game and sort of an alternative to get ready for running group content. It's not like missions have to have the best gear, but it could just simply empower their character a little bit. Then I also thought that maybe the gear could be disenchanted with the Flame of Encalamir. And for low-level players, they would get motes of enchantment, and that could also introduce these newer players to that system. And then for low level cap characters, they could get something relevant to endgame with Embers of Enchantment, just like all the other endgame gear. But that is what I had for those two suggestions. Again, my two main ones, I think the best ones. And I think it is good to keep the perspective that rewards don't need to be insane for each individual mission you run just because they are super quick bursts of gameplay. But I just think at this point the system doesn't have enough to promote players to run it and reward them for going through the mission system. The only thing it seems really useful for is getting cosmetics on whatever character you play through it on and getting a little bit of XP. And with all that, as I have talked about so much now, I think there should be more, and the system is just poorly executed because players have little reason to run missions. Alright, that is what I have for this video. It honestly did get a little bit out of hand, but I think it is okay. And just to quickly summarize my points, the idea of missions is really great, but because us players have no motivation to run them, from no reward for our time invested in them, the implementation of missions in the game is poorly executed. I think the system just needs some major but easy improvements, and that just unfortunately makes missions frustrating to me. And as far as this video goes, even with the odd structure and pacing, I hope you all did enjoy it and learned about the mission system in this review. And if you did, please consider liking and subscribing for more, or becoming a channel member to support the content. And thanks for watching, everyone.